Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my pleasure to welcome to today's program Chris Jones, who is Executive Vice President for Marketing and Services at Descartes. And today we're going to talk about collaboration in the network, the what, how, and why. Certainly, collaboration is one of those topics that never gets old. It's always top of mind for a lot of supply chain logistics executives, and we're going to kind of continue to explore that topic today with kind of a different angle, coming at it from, from a network-based, platforms and solutions, and how those, that kind of technology, that kind of solution can help facilitate collaboration. Before we get started, just want to remind all of you that are joining us today live that if you do want to ask a question, you can go ahead and do so via the submit a question button or via the live chat feature. And I'll keep an eye on it, and any good questions come up, I'll try to weave them into the conversation. So with that, Chris, welcome to the program.
Great, thanks to be here, Adrian.
As you can tell, I was going to wear my Halloween costume today, but instead I opted for the Red Sox hat, considering they won the World Series yesterday. And I see that you've got the blessed bee on your head as well.
Yeah, I have two kids going to school in Massachusetts, so and my son's a big Red Sox Nation kid, so had it on this weekend. I'm going to take it off here in a second, but we're good to go.
Okay, great. Well, before we kind of dive into the topic of collaboration, I always like to ask my guests, how they even got involved in the supply chain logistics industry, because, although we're seeing more and more students today and more universities today offering supply chain logistics programs, certainly when you and I were at the university level, the visibility to this industry was not quite as high as it is today. Even though there's more work to be done in that area today. So tell us a little bit about kind of your career path, how you got involved with supply chain logistics, and kind of what your current role and responsibilities are at Descartes today.
Sure. Well, I hate to say I'm going to date myself, but I started, let's say when I was in college, no one even knew what the term supply chain was, and I think technically it came out somewhere around 1984, which I got to tell you, I was already out of school, so it didn't really exist. It was logistics, which really was transportation, and then manufacturing, and then you could say procurement, and procurement really was purchasing at the time. So it was kind of split up. I started with a company that was originally called General Foods, then became part of the Philip Morris and Kraft world, and I worked in various roles in operations and technology. Along the way, I did a stint at Gartner where I ran the enterprise apps business for a while, helped start the logistics service, moved on from there after a couple of years to a supply chain vendor by the name of Synquest, who was doing some pretty innovative stuff in the market, and kind of have been on it in a couple other roles in the space. So I've been on the user, vendor, analyst sides of this market, and for me, what's interesting about that is you get a much broader perspective of what's out there and what's working. And my current role is I run really two parts of Descartes. I run the marketing organization, so really helping us to figure out where we're going to go and get the word out. But equally, I run professional services, so I deal with a tremendous amount of our customers and actually implementing the solutions. And that's really, I would describe as where I get a huge amount of education. The advantage that we have is that we literally are dealing with hundreds of companies at a given point in time, and a lot of them are doing some very innovative things, and that really is what helps frame really our thinking, and I'll describe as what I'm seeing as some pretty significant practices in this area.
Great. So let's talk about, and I think that's great. I mean, I think kind of having that background, that experience, coming at it from the user standpoint, the technology standpoint, the analyst standpoint, you've got some pretty good perspective there from practical frontline experience to kind of analyzing things from an analyst standpoint, and now from a technology standpoint. So like I mentioned in my introductory comments, I mean, collaboration. I've been at this now for 15 years, and collaboration was a hot topic 15 years ago. It still remains a hot topic today, and I always say that relatively speaking, few companies have walked the talk with regards to collaboration. You've kind of made the investments and taken the action to actually make it work. But that said, I think, and particularly this year, I'm seeing more and more companies, really kind of becoming, interested in collaboration. There's kind of this renewed interest and motivation towards, understanding who's doing what with regards to collaboration, understanding, perhaps, there might have been some barriers in the past, and now kind of relooking at those and thinking about how to overcome them. Do you agree that, I mean, are you seeing the same thing? Do you agree that collaboration is kind of a topic that's got renewed interest and motivation today? And if so, what do you think is driving it?
Well, it definitely has a lot, I think a lot more substance to it. I think there's a couple reasons. One of them is an extremely simple one, which is that, for most corporations, there's still a huge focus on cutting costs. At the same time, they're having to deal with much higher expectations on the customer service side of the world. And, when you get to the cost side of it, there's an old saying, you can squeeze the lemon one more time and get another drop of juice out. But if you're introspective, you've probably been doing this for a while. And in fact, many of the costs that you have are really related to how you work in the ecosystem or ecosystems that you operate in. So companies are really looking for ways to be able to work with their trading partners, suppliers, carriers, logistics service providers, as examples, and even, let's say, on the outbound side with their customers on trying to drive their costs down. Equally, from a service point of view, having what I would describe as very static models don't really allow you to deal with the reality that's out there, which is things don't always go the way they're supposed to go. So if you don't really have ways to be able to interact with those trading partners very efficiently, you really can't scale. You really can't drive costs out, and you run into issues where by yourself you can't solve them on your own.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo the same thing. I mean, the way I've been kind of describing it to folks is that, um, supply chain logistics is about exceptions. I mean, nothing ever goes according to plan. So change has always been kind of the constant in the industry. What's different today is that change is happening so much faster, and a lot of companies and executives are trying to figure out how do they keep up with this rapid pace, and they're realizing that their existing processes or existing systems, ways of working, are reaching kind of a ceiling, and they have to kind of look kind of more holistically and look more creatively in terms of ways of working together, not only internally but externally as well, to really try to keep up with the rapid pace of change, whether it's just trying to keep up with the rapid change of customer expectations and consumer expectations, or regulations, things that are happening on the transportation side, for example, with capacity and hours of service and CSA and so on and so forth. So it's just trying to manage that change is what I hear from a lot of companies. But at the same time, there's a lot of on this program a few weeks ago, I talked about collaboration. I talked about some of the barriers that I see to collaboration. So I'm kind of curious if you were to come up with a list of the top two or three barriers that companies face with regards to collaboration. What are they from your perspective, and why have these barriers been so difficult to overcome?
Right. Well, I think the first one is when you talk about collaboration, and let's talk about it in terms of exchanging information. It's really standardizing that information. A lot of the supply chain and logistics world really presents itself as a good opportunity to standardize the information. So where a lot of companies struggle is they struggle with the basics. They can't get the data, or they can't present the data, or they can't share the data. And when I say that, share that across the trading partners they have, and the logistics community they work with, in a way that allows anybody to be able to make sense of it. So if you can't deal with a lot of the basics, you really struggle with moving to the more advanced things that said, boy, if I only knew all these things were going on, maybe I would do things differently. They don't really allow that to happen. So this is where we see a lot of it. There's just a struggle on getting the information standardized and being able to present it in a way that all parties get to see it. The other thing that I think that we see quite a bit of challenge in is creating what I would call multi-party environments. If you think about some of the things that are going on now, and probably we'll talk about this at some point today, is that things like co-loading of freight and so forth, those have been around forever. People think about that. And the scale is really small relative to what can be done. A lot of it has to do with having let's call it a forum, okay, of that standardized data that various interested parties can interact with. So that's part of where we see it, where people have struggled. And I think now when you look at cloud-based technology and the ability of networks to pull data together, I think we're going to see a lot more of it. But those are really two of the fundamental things that we see with our customers.
Yeah, no, and I agree, and which leads me to my next question. I mean, it's no secret that I'm a big proponent of what I've been calling supply chain operating networks, for the past 10 years, and Descartes an example. Certainly, there are other network providers out there that kind of offer the same model, if you will, and I believe that supply chain operating networks are really the ideal platform for collaboration because in general, what you're doing is you're bringing together all of that data and all of the trading partners together on one platform. So it seems to me that that's kind of the prerequisite, right? It kind of sets the foundation there to be able to do collaboration more effectively. But that said, and you and I talked about this before. I think the version 1.0, if you will, or the initial approach is to use these platforms simply to transact data, right? To kind of help automate or simplify, automate the existing processes. And companies are still either reluctant or afraid to share data. You mentioned that before, kind of sharing the data and kind of the barriers to that. Do you so hence they're not fully tapping the opportunity, the full opportunity to really drive new forms of collaboration because of this barrier to sharing data. Do you agree? And how do you help companies, or what do you tell the companies that you work with? How do you help them try to overcome that hurdle?
Well, I think that one of the ways is let's just describe it as it somewhat pulls you in different directions. One of them is you got to go get the data first and foremost. So having a way to be able to pull that together, and we view kind of our network in some respects as a very big vacuum cleaner of data across all the different people that you work with. But after that, really, it's out kind of the opposite story. You have to say, hey, I'm going to pull together a select group of my trading partners, forwarders, carriers, even customers, and we're going to look at what's going on, okay, with the information that we're collecting to get people a view of that. And this is where it's sort of the start small, start selective, trust in the people that you're working with, where you can get together and say, hey, let me, for instance, give you a visual view of how our collective ecosystem has product moving through it, all right? And who's really touching it, and how is this all interacting, and what's it doing to things like lead times, inventories, reliability, all this other kinds of stuff where you start to really score those aspects of it. That's one key thing. The second thing I think is really, really important. It goes back to data, and it's to get everybody to understand the importance of having the data and data quality. I'll just say this: a lot of people talk out of both sides of their mouth in this market about, oh, we believe in it, but I'm going to tell you, with all the work that we do, supplier and carrier performance on data is not great. It's not as good as it could or should be. Some markets are much better. I'll give you an example. The air industry does a phenomenal job there. It has its own set of challenges, but they've worked on standardization and a number of things there. The ocean industry, ocean cargo industry, it's not there. All right. Timeliness, completeness, it's a real work in process. So you got to get both of those things going. So it's the share, know who you want to get to, focus on the data quality aspects of it. And when you start to do that, then all of a sudden people can look at it, and the goal is to open it up. All right. And that's one of the points I want to make here, is that you want to be able to present this in a way that says, hey, here's the broader picture. I don't necessarily have all the answers, but let me show you what's going on. Because the what's going on is largely what a lot of people don't see. What they see is their little piece of your bigger story. And in fact, you may be a piece of someone else's bigger story. So how do you really bring those together? And you really need to do it with people that, you, again, trust is so important, that you can work with and get a feel for what's going on here, because this is what then gives you the opportunity to look at, how you run your supply chain differently.
Yeah, data quality management, that's been one of my soapbox issues for over a decade. I mean, one of the things that I remember, I interviewed about 10 CIOs and technology executives from 3PLs a number of years ago, and the comment, and, the common thread between my conversations with them that still sticks in my mind is they say they spend at least half of their time cleaning and cleansing data from an IT perspective, which is mind-boggling when you think about, really the amount of time and resources they spend on just cleansing and maintaining the status quo instead of investing that time and resources and money on innovation and driving new capabilities, so on and so forth. Um, you talked about, being able to provide, companies with a view or a picture of kind of the opportunities, or um, what's happening in the broader network. I mean, does that mean that the other buzz term in the industry is business intelligence and analytics, right? I mean, it sounds to me that that's kind of a part of the evolution that needs to happen with regards to BI and analytics is, not just only provide a view of, okay, how am I doing according to plan, or how am I doing according to last year's budget, or things like that, but it's not providing kind of network level BI and analysis. Where are we there, and what kind of capabilities is required to really provide that picture, that visibility to companies?
That's a great point, and I think there's a couple pieces to it. One, most of the tools are still enterprise tools. So part of the challenge that you have if you start collecting data, let's say across your ecosystem, which is you want to open it up in a view of the flow that's happening across it, and the enterprise typical view has been what I call it's the center of the universe. So go back to the days of when everybody thought that the sun revolved around the earth. Okay, that's the typical enterprise applications perspective. So you've got to really look at models that do a couple things. One, allow you to map your supply chains from an end-to-end perspective. The second part of it is that everybody has a different constituency or view that as part of that process. And so how do they get to see what they're supposed to be able to see, and how can you partition that up in a way that, for instance, now if you start to look at sharing, you may say, hey, I'd like these suppliers to look how they could work together to get goods, for instance, into my facilities. Or I may say, oh, maybe I need to really look at how I work with others. This is where it gets very interesting, is I may end up working with other companies to serve maybe a retailer, as an example, that they're not, I didn't even think about them before in terms of an ecosystem. So how do I get that data and put that to be together and allow people to get the views that they really need to have? So I think we use the term big data. I think big data at the enterprise level has moved along very, very, very fast. I think it still has a ways to go in this particular space, because as you said it earlier, a lot of it was really around things like financial performance, and I'll call it customer related data, those kinds of things. But now we're talking about supply chains or ecosystems, and again, you may be in a completely different position in an ecosystem, depending on really which ecosystem you're participating in. And the interesting thing is, most companies actually, whether they know it or not, they participate in many different ecosystems.
Absolutely. And you talk about ecosystems, and obviously you work with a lot of different types of companies in the logistics, broader logistics ecosystem, manufacturers and retailers, trucking companies, ocean companies, air companies, 3PL, so on and so forth. Um, so let's talk about some of the examples. I mean, you mentioned co-loading, which is, I think a starting point for a lot of companies in the logistics world, in the transportation world, where they think about, well, can we co-load our freight with somebody else, and share transportation capacity? And certainly that's an area that I'm seeing a lot of interest in, because of concerns about what might happen to trucking capacity down the road with hours of service and driver turnover, so on and so forth. But like you mentioned before, that's a conversation, and that's an opportunity that's been well recognized. There are some examples out there of companies doing that already. Um, but I think that what we're talking about here is that when you're thinking about a network-based collaboration, it opens the door to kind of new and different types of collaborative opportunities when you have the visibility to that broader data, when you've got that connectivity with a broader ecosystem. So can you give us some examples of kind of some of the collaboration opportunities that are possible in network model, if companies were willing to share their data, and if they had that visibility that you just talked about?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to think about this. One, let's go back to something you said earlier, which is supply chains are changing, okay? And what's the half-life of a business relationship these days? And particularly if you're a logistics service provider, we do a lot with logistics service providers around the world, and they probably have the most temporal business out there. It varies by customer and contracts and how all those various pieces come together. Now, what's also interesting about that particular market, and really probably was the leader in this whole notion of ecosystems, is that the vast majority of logistics service providers, even the biggest ones, work with someone else to move. Let's say if you're a manufacturer, retailer, importer, exporter, whatever term you want to use, they're moving their goods with your goods with multiple people, especially if it's a global move. Even the biggest ones in the world do it. All right, so they have to work together. So as you look at this, you have to say things like, "Hey, I'm looking at moving goods through a network. Who runs in the lanes that I, for instance, don't support, or who offers a service in a lane that I don't support? How do I find those kinds of people?" And today, it's really tribal knowledge and so forth. The other part of it is, as we talk about collaboration, is one thing is let's call it the data, okay, which we got to get to, all right? And part of that whole story is, for instance, how electronically enabled are the people that you want to work with, all right? So as we start talking about collaboration, collaboration can really be finding the people that you want to be able to work with, and do they have the electronic capabilities, not just the physical capabilities, but the electronic ones that you need to have for your business to get conducted. So it really becomes down to looking at a collaboration of, we would call like a sub-community of interest, all right? People that need to be able to work together. And those relationships will come and go. Some of them could be measured in years. Others could really be measured in a given customer activity or opportunity in the market. So we see it, let's call it, at a business relationship perspective, being able to collaborate, and how do you do it in a seamless way. I think that's probably been one of the biggest challenges in this market. It's not been very efficient in terms of logistics, because the minute you start crossing companies, all of a sudden, the electronic side of the world gets a little sketchy depending on who you're dealing with. That's one good example. Another one that's out there, that's been out for a while, and I don't think people think about it this way, is the whole GS1 global data sync data pool. All right, that's a great example of parties coming together and standardized data, sharing it across organizations. What I think is, it's still an untapped opportunity in terms of what else can be done in that particular space and leveraging it. So let me give you an example. Why should a logistician care about GS1? Well, what's interesting is the data that you kill for to get into your TM systems, or to give to your carriers or logistics service providers, in terms of packaging, cartons, case configurations, pallets, stackability, all this other stuff is also standardized in that arena. All right, so now all of a sudden I can look and say, gee, I could really share information at a different level. It's not just a product catalog and pricing and those kinds of things. There's a lot of spaces like that. And the best way that I like to look at is the following. There's really four major buckets of collaboration that supply chain folks should really care about. All right, and it revolves around these four major multi-party processes that go on. All right, so the first one is that whole product information collaboration piece, all right, that I just mentioned. The second one is really around commercial transactions. So think of it as POs to invoices and how that all works out, okay, all the way, through from POs to ASNs or acknowledgments and so forth. The third one is a logistics process. The classic "I'm going to move the goods" story. All right, so transportation orders and uh, acknowledgments and tendering and acceptance and proof of delivery, all those kind of good things. And then the fourth bucket is now, especially for the, let's call it, international global moves, is customs. All right, I've got to get clearance to move across the borders, and I've also got to, for instance, pay the duties associated with importing or exporting. Right. So what's interesting about every one of those is they have data that they can share. All right. So what if I could start pulling those together? So if you think about it, purchase orders turned into ASNs, which turned into transport orders or bills of lading, which ends up in customs filings. All right, so look at all that data that's really common, that all of a sudden you can provide that visibility to a supply chain as to what's going on. Okay, did the goods clear? Well, that really does matter. Okay, it matters not just for the shipper, but maybe the logistics service provider that is actually going to move these goods. All right, as an example, it also ties in then to the commercial invoice and what you pay in terms of the duties and so forth. So, all those things really need to be looked at. In a little bit different light. And the data, once you start pulling that data together, you get all of this leverage of what is in fact really going on in your supply chain. So now you can enable it at many different levels than just looking, for instance, at which, as you were mentioning, looking at the whole notion of, gee, can I merge shipments together? I in fact really want to look at maybe how I import or export, where I'm paying my costs, what are truly my costs, what are the things that are causing shipments to not move efficiently through my supply chain? All those things come together in those four areas.
Great examples. I've got a few, just a handful of questions here to go that I want to ask you and kind of build upon some of the things you just said. But I just want to remind those of you that are joining us today live that if you do have a question for Chris, kind of now's the time to start, thinking about it and posting it in the, submit a question button. I'll take a look at it, and again, if we have time, I'll try to weave them into the conversation. As you were talking, one of the things that occurred to me, you were referring to. You want to see what kind of people you want to work with. I think there you were referring to really, companies, right? But the opportunity also, one of the things, as you know, I've done a lot of research and writing and thinking about the role of social networking in the supply chain logistics, arena. And in some ways, I look at the supply chain operating networks as kind of the Facebook equivalents in the business world, right? So while you have the opportunity to leverage these networks for company to company relationships and managing processes, there's also the opportunity for people to people collaboration and communication, right? So, hey, I'm Adrian on the network, you're Chris on the network, you're my supplier or you're my customer, is for Adrian to be able to communicate with you, Chris, to talk about, either to help manage an exception that's occurred or to just to get a status update or whatever the case might be. I think we're still in the very, very early stages of thinking and enabling these networks to be the quote unquote Facebooks for supply chain logistics. Your thoughts on that opportunity and where we are today?
Right. Well, I think your point's a very good one. Let's go back to something you said before, that a lot of what has evolved in what I'll call it networks or multi-party applications is really around, let's say, processing transactions. Even if I go back to the enterprise side of the world, there's probably a somewhat arrogant notion that people spend their entire day in front of a computer just doing this transactional type of work, and it's really not the case. All right, and it is people working together. So if you go to the logistics world, what you find is that somebody working in the forwarder community is probably spending a fair amount of their time on the phone with various people, trying to move goods, trying to look at how they're addressing customers and working with, for instance, carriers. So there's a lot of really multi-party things that go on outside of the applications. Now, the challenge that we've seen is that how do you bring those two pieces together and really create, let's call it, we use the term sub-communities of interest, or again, back to my point about an ecosystem, that allows the people that you're working with to get together to address the things that they want. And what tools can you provide them to enable them to do business. And what we find is that people operate in multiple sub-communities. So let me give a couple real quick examples, all right? If you're in a logistics company and obviously a forwarder, you're doing global moves, you work in the air cargo industry, so you work with the carriers and maybe other forwarders. You're also dealing with customs filings, so you may say, well, gee, I need to know what's going on related to the latest U.S. regulations for something like ACAS related to its air cargo advanced screening. You may want to know how that's going to impact what you're doing. All right. So now the question is, how can you provide tools to enable those same individuals who are working in your logistics solutions to be able to be more effective and interact with the people that they interact with, and that's where I think there's some very specific tools and some things, quite frankly, that we're working on in that space that allow people to be able to interact with the folks that matter to them. And here's the thing: it's not when you really let's take something like Facebook or LinkedIn or something like that. That if you really look at it, let's take Facebook. Okay, billion plus what, billion three people using it. You don't interact with a billion three. Okay, you have maybe if you're a busy person, 100, 150 or so people that you interact with, maybe even more, that follow you or something like that. But you react with a subsegment, excuse me, subsegment of the total world there. All right. Now, in the business world, you want that to be somewhat restricted. All right, especially if it's about working in specific relationships with customers or business propositions and so forth. So how do you have tools that allow you to invite people to, again, this whole notion of something that could be very temporal, but a community of interest that says, hey, how are you handling these particular issues? I've got a challenge out there. I've got to move these goods. Who can help me do that? Think of those kinds of things that are out there. Then you need the tools that allow you to make the transactions work, and that's where we think that's where the intersection is of that. So this is really about, I don't know what this is the magic term, Adrian. You need to invent one that gets us to beyond social networking to business, really business networking, and that's what people are looking for.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was at a user conference earlier this year, and one of the things I heard from the customers that were, as the vendor was looking for feedback and solicitation, even in the software world, they were looking for these, what I would call peer-to-peer learning and networking capability for, everyone in that room to, they were all obviously collaborating and communicating and sharing their ideas there live in person at the event. And I know you've got your user conference coming up in just a couple of weeks here, right? So it's a great opportunity to bring your customers together, and it's a great, one of the value propositions is to, network and communicate and share ideas. The thing is, how do you sustain that on an ongoing basis, and then from a business context, as well. And I think that's the opportunity, to maintain that peer-to-peer, communication and collaboration and learning, using, these networks. We got a question here from Dean, kind of a high-level question, but I think it's an important one. So let me put it up here on the screen. And Dean asks, how do we measure collaboration efforts, right? So I mean, I think it's always, to kind of paraphrase it in some ways, business people always say, well, what's going to be the ROI, or the return on investment, or what's going to be the business case for us to collaborate versus what we're currently doing today? What are your thoughts on that in terms of kind of measuring the efforts, or and the potential benefits of collaboration?
Well, I mean, you could view it as a couple different levels. I mean, I'm going to kind of go backwards on this for a second. Is I think based on what I've seen, it always comes back to the business results at the end of the day here. So if you said, for instance, your goal was to work with your trading partners to drive down transportation costs or cut your cycle time down, I mean, you really can start at that particular level. I think the question is, what does the tools do that allow you to do that? To me, it comes down to, like I said, things like visualization. It can come down to your ability to coordinate. So let me give you a good example. Is how do I manage my goods in transit when I don't really own those goods. I don't own the freight. How do I bring those people together? We've seen people, some large retailers as an example, be able to, let me give just one real quick example where actually in New England 2 years ago, we had a hurricane roll through, and our customer, in this case CVS, knew it was going to happen. What do people typically want in a CVS store when you get to those situations? It's going to be the water, flashlights, batteries, all that stuff. What they were able to do was to really stop a lot of goods in motion, even goods that normally would have been important, by being able to work with the carriers and the suppliers. So, for instance, and CVS didn't own this freight, okay, so it wasn't CVS controlled freight. They were able to then, if you will, clear the lanes and accelerate purchase orders and get that, those commodities that people want and in their stores, and they were very successful in terms of not having as many out of stocks and so forth. So I think it goes, at the end of the day, it comes back to where the business is. Now, from a how earnest are people, and if people are looking for metrics on collaboration, of like, well, is it number of interactions or, those kinds of things. I don't know if I have an answer for that, because like I said, I really tie it back to what the end game is here, and which maybe gets me to one last point. When you're doing collaboration, you better know where you want to go. What the effect is, and make it clear to all the different parties that are involved that, hey, we have some fundamental goals, and we'd like to open the forum, if you will, for ideas, to be able to address those goals. So it's not that part of it should not be nebulous, because I don't think you will get people then to understand what, or produce results when there's no clear, let's call it, a unifying objective.
Great, great. Dean, thank you for the great question. I'll just add my quick 2 cents to that. I think, that there's different types of, collaboration, and then the scope can vary significantly. There could be things that are very finite and relatively short term in nature, and then there are things that, one of the big topics that I'm a big proponent of is, the vested model, which tends to be more from a strategic, longer term perspective. So there might be things where, your objectives might be to capture greater market share over the next 5 years, or really transform a whole industry, right, with a partner. I think if you look at kind of the recent news with, Amazon being co-located within P&G warehouses to do fulfillment out of those warehouses, I think that there is a form of collaboration that I think is new, unique, different, and I can only imagine how those conversations went, and what the, how they measure those, the benefits of that type of collaboration. But I think obviously that's a different type of collaboration than perhaps things that are a little bit more shorter term, or more day to day in nature. So thank you for the question, Dean. If anybody else has a question as we're wrapping up here, please post it now. Kind of my second to last question here, with regards to, collaboration. I mean, personally, I think, and I believe that, from the examples that I've seen, that to make collaboration work, you need a trusted, neutral third party, such as a 3PL, to kind of really help identify, manage, and execute, that process. Others believe, and I think, the promise, I think, with some of these supply chain operating networks, and some of the things we talked about today, is that, through better data sharing and visibility, you can argue that you can empower companies for themselves to identify those opportunities, and to reach out to other parties within their ecosystem or within adjacent ecosystems, and really drive that, and work directly and drive that collaboration directly themselves. Which camp do you feel, do you fall in, and what are your thoughts on that?
I would tell you that we fall in both, and let me tell you the why. Because we actually have customers on both sides trying to do the same thing. If you're, let's just say you're maybe a larger retailer, distributor, or manufacturer, whatever, there may be an opportunity for you to be able to, I'll call it, really initiate the conversation, and And by the way, the forwarders and that you work with or carriers you work with are equally part of that conversation. That's one of the things we think is, by the way, most important. It's not just a, I'll call it supplier or buyer relationship. It's everybody else in between that needs to be part of it. So we've seen those kinds of companies take on this task themselves because they felt if they really got their ecosystem in the game, that they could all collectively get a lot of value out of it. Equally, we see other companies who go to, let's say, the forwarder or 3PL community to perform those services. I would describe it as really where are the pinch points in your supply chain and how do you want to address them? And are there some specific instances where someone's going to be, I'll call it, in a better logical position to manage that conversation? So we help enable both sides of that, and we see value in those folks that are doing it. So I would love to say that there's a right or a wrong here, but I really believe it has to do with the company and and where they want to dive into this particular situation, if they think they have the expertise or they think, like I said, they're at that pinch point.
Great, great. So let's kind of to wrap it up, on the topic of collaboration. So how do you get companies to act and think differently with regards to collaboration? I mean, for those people listening today here live, or those that might be watching this on demand, what kind of steps should they be taking today to kind of start realizing the benefits of a network-based, collaboration, everything that we talked about here today?
All right. Well, I think there's just a couple key points that really stick in my mind here. One of them is that think bigger than yourself. All right. Like I said, the classic enterprise view, and it's not just enterprise apps, because enterprise apps reflect how people think. Okay, is to get yourself out beyond your view of the world and look at that ecosystem that you operate in. If you're consumer goods manufacturer, you know who you're working with on the other end, and there's multiple of those kinds of customers that you have, and obviously the suppliers that you have in your network. So as you really look at pulling the picture together, you've got to be able to say, all right, how do these goods go, end to end, and who plays what role in making that happen? That's where I would say that we saw with some of our customers that were they woke up to the real importance of their logistics service providers and carriers and in how they're really helping to drive their supply chain performance. Like I said earlier, a lot of people get stuck with the supplier buyer notion, and there's always somebody moving the goods, right? So they play a huge percentage of the interactions and sometimes even the end-to-end performance. So that's think big. You got to think big. All right. The second one is that don't view this as a serial process, end to end. I got a supplier and they put it on a truck and they delivered to my plant and I produced it and I put it in my DC. Blah blah blah, out to my end customer. All right, or customer's customer. A lot of where the value is looking horizontally in any one of those areas and say, you know what, I'm in an ecosystem here, and I'm one of many people that, for instance, serve a retailer or serve a manufacturer. Well, how could I do stuff together? I'll give you an example. Not even the consumer goods world. This started years ago. All right. Again, it doesn't scale without technology, but there's an automotive parts manufacturer. They weren't even a tier one. Who looked and said that, hey, the OEMs were saying to them, you got to take your costs down. And of course, everybody knows the beatdown that goes on in that marketplace and on product price. And what they said was, well, maybe if we actually looked at how we commingled and drove our freight costs down, we could take that as opposed to getting hit over the head on the piece part pricing. So that's a good example of where the play was horizontal. It wasn't just them, it was them looking across other people. Now we're starting to see all this co-loading stuff that's going on, and that's another view, best way to view that. So my two simple ones are think of the bigger picture end to end, and then look at it horizontally and all the different people that are in there, not just you in your little piece of it, but in fact you and maybe even some of your competitors or what I'll call complementary companies serving the same customers.
Great, great words of advice, and I definitely would echo them as well. So, kind of to wrap up here, kind of shifting gears completely, from collaboration, I'll end with the question I always like to end with when I interview my guests, and that is, one of our goals here at Talking Logistics is to, reach out to students and young professionals, those just getting started in the supply chain logistics industry, and really have, folks such as yourselves, with a diverse experience and a pulse on what's happening in the market and where things are heading, to give them some advice. So what advice would you give to students and young professionals? Some of the things that they ought to be doing today or thinking about today to help pave a successful career path, down the road.
Yeah. Well, I happen to have, like I said before, I've got two kids in college. I've got a sophomore and a junior, and I guess I'll start with kind of the basics, which is one, make sure you have what I'll call it some kind of marketable skill. And these days, particularly in the supply chain arena, understanding of finance, understanding of technology are they're absolutely key. You got to walk in with something where you can help break down and analyze problems. And many these days really fall into those two buckets. It's either a financial challenge or a technology challenge. From there, the other thing I'd bring up to someone who's, let's say, out of school at this point in time is, one of the things that I love to focus on is debunking widely held myths in supply chain, and there are a lot of them. Okay, and I'll throw the one out there that I guarantee will get some reactions, maybe not on here instantly, but other people seeing this, is there's this whole notion that higher service levels for customers cost you more money. And you know what? If you do things the same way you do it and you try to just make it a little bit better, you're right. Okay, but I can tell you that for instance, I've got some people that I work with that they've actually turned that upside down. Higher service means higher revenue, means higher margins, and actually means lower supply chain costs. All right. And our market and what makes this market so interesting, supply chain always unique. I get up every day and see something amazing going on, is that people are out there thinking about their worlds differently. And so to the degree that you, as a younger professional, you get a chance to really look at things and challenge them, or see people out there that are doing different things, understand the why they're doing it or what they're thinking about. That's as important as the what it is that they ended up doing, because this market is evolving. We're not anywhere close to done. I've heard this before, and it just aggravated me that people thought everything was invented in supply chain, and it is not even the case. And people who were the winners 10 plus years ago in the market, considered dominant players in supply chain, today are, um, just some of them are taking an absolute beating because they didn't reinvent themselves. And someone else came along with a new model. So those are the things to me. Get some good skills, financial skills, technical skills. Number one, number two, get out there and understand what's going on and really get a feel for challenging and the traditional norms and pay attention to what people are doing in terms of reinventing the market and approaches to the business.
Challenge the traditional norms. I love that. I think that's great advice, and I think that's something that all of us, not only young professionals, but those of us that have been in the industry for a while, ought to be doing all the time, because it is a dynamic and challenging environment out there. With that, Chris, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today. I know you're getting ready for your user conference in a few weeks, and certainly look forward to kind of seeing and hearing the news that comes out of your event in a few weeks.
Well, Adrian, I really appreciate getting the time today, and anybody's got any questions along the way, obviously feel free to get a hold of Adrian, and you can contact me through Descartes. Like I said, there's lots of great stuff going on out there, and particularly in the world of collaboration. I think we're just really at the infancy of the merging of let's call it social or business networking with a lot of technology that's going on right now, and I believe we will continue to see some new and exciting business models here.
Great, great. And for those of you that joined us live today, thank you very much for your time, and Dean for asking your question. If you do have a question for Chris, and those of you that are watching the replay of this, feel free to find this episode at talkinglogistics.com and post a question or a comment there, and Chris will certainly be happy to respond and provide his perspective there as well. So Again, thank all of you for joining us. Spread the word. If you've got colleagues or young professionals within your company that you think would benefit from attending these episodes or watching the archives, let them know, let your colleagues know. And certainly look forward to seeing you all in a future episode of Talking Logistics. And maybe in the future, Chris, we'll come back on. I don't know what your favorite football team is. I don't know if the Boston Allegiance spreads out to the Patriots or not. But if so, maybe we'll be wearing different hats next time around.
Well, it won't be the Falcons this year, that's for sure. No, we'll see, Adrian.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all. Have a great week, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.